For the government, levelling up means four things. We want to strengthen local leadership. Great mayors, like Andy Street, driving real change. We also want to raise living standards, especially where they're lower. We want to improve public services, especially where they're weaker. And we also want to give people the resources necessary to enhance a sense of pride in the place where they live.
Well, let's start this conversation with my first guest, Mark Littlewood, the Director of the Institute of Economic Affairs. Hi, Mark. A lot of platitudes. I mean, we keep hearing all the goals of levelling up, which sounds like, frankly, an old Labour manifesto. But we're not really being told how to do this. And the thing certainly that Gove has just said, we want everyone to buy their first home. For the past 15 years, it's been a Tory government apparently preventing people getting on the housing ladder. Again, with living standards, they've slashed the credit, the universal credit top-up. They're talking about public services, but where has the investment been in 15 years? Is this just supposed to be music to voters' ears, and can they deliver?
See, at the moment, Alex, I think this is a slogan looking for a policy agenda. The only thing that seems to be behind levelling up is shoveling a lot of money in the direction of these particular red wall areas, and I think that's a rather unimaginative way to do it. Or, as we heard from Michael Gove there, perhaps even more local politicians, more mayors, more powers for local councils, and then this rather nebulous stuff about, you know, pride in your local area. Well, I'm all in favour of that, but I'm not quite sure what Boris Johnson and his government can do about it. So I think it would be far better to explain what we're going to do to these areas to encourage enterprise. And you know what, that's a pretty straightforward recipe. You need lower taxes, you need lighter regulation, you need it to be easier to set up a business and employ people. I reckon I could put together a pretty good levelling up agenda as an actual policy platform. But unfortunately, we've heard precious little of that from the Conservatives so far at this conference.
I'm going to say, go ahead and put forward that agenda. They could definitely do with it. But, I mean, frankly, we've had a Conservative government now for 15 years, and most people out there have seen their wages going down. Most people out there, as you know, first-time buyers have been struggling to get on the housing ladder. During the pandemic, the government unleashed a load of policy that seems to help the developers and those who wanted to buy second homes or upgrade their house, but certainly not people struggling to get their first home. I mean, can a leopard really change its spots? They're putting up national insurance to pay for social care. Another thing which seems to squeeze those who least need to be squeezed for the benefit of those who probably have, you know, masses of savings in the bank.
I think that's a very fair criticism, Alex, and indeed the national insurance rise is an imposition on workers and not really an imposition on the elderly. It is, of course, true that the elderly vote for Conservatives in much greater numbers than the young. So if the over 65s are the Conservatives' target audience, you could understand that, maybe not morally or economically, but as an act of electoral politics. But they seem to be rather punishing those who are working, and in these red wall areas, an extra 1% or so on your national insurance contributions, well, that could make quite a lot of difference. So you say, can a leopard change its spots? You know, I think it possibly can. I'm just about willing to give them the benefit of the doubt. The Tories have been in power for 11 years, but this is the third iteration of a Conservative government after David Cameron and Theresa May. And you might, if you wanted to be a very sympathetic observer, say that Boris Johnson's government needed to get Brexit done. It's had the pandemic to deal with. We're perhaps at the end of that now. Now, and only now, can it turn its attention to a sensible domestic agenda. But my worry is their domestic agenda doesn't really seem to be about cutting back the state, lowering tax, reducing regulation. It seems to be entirely a challenge of how much money can we spend and how quickly can we spend it. And that is not a recipe for long-term growth in the Red Wall or anywhere else in Britain.
Mark, thank you so much for your take on Conservative economics at the moment and levelling up. Who knows what it means? We'll continue to try and find out. Well, joining me now to give his take on this is independent economist Julian Jessup. Julian, do you understand what the government are banging on about when they keep repeating levelling up? Do you get what their recipe for success is? Do they have one?
Well, I'll start by echoing a lot of what your previous speaker, Mark Littlewood, said. And I must admit, I'm a friend of his and I occasionally work with him at the IEA. So we're not going to take an entirely different point of view. I think the levelling up agenda, it's a good slogan, and I sort of much prefer it to what some other parties are coming up with, because often their policies seem to be about levelling down, class war politics of making the rich worse off without necessarily making the poorer better off. But I have some concerns about what it means in practice as well. I think for a start, it's wrong to talk about a simple north-south divide. There are plenty of poor people in the south of England and in London as well. It may well be that average incomes are higher, but so are costs in the south. I think we need to recognise that. I think also you have to ask, what is the specific market failure that justifies government intervention? Is just spending more government money the answer? And I think often it isn't. It's possible there might be a few things like infrastructure, for example, where the North may have got a bad deal in the past and where the government could probably justify spending a bit more money now. But in general, I think it's about getting the fundamentals of the whole economy right, and then all parts of the country will benefit from that, without targeting money at particular areas and particular constituencies, which I think could lead to cronyism. So you're just spending more money in red wall constituencies because you think that will buy you votes.
But that's often the way most political parties work, isn't it? And certainly, I think they had a bit of a shock in the Amersham by-election when it came to people saying we don't want these developments taking place in our back gardens, and yet they've got to build more houses. So how do they square this? Because one thing that seems to strike me is here is a government talking about, this the onset, the stagnation of decline, the social mobility gap getting wider and wider, and yet it's the same government for the last 15 years. It's been 3 consecutive Conservative governments. So they have presided over this perceived gulf that's emerged between the haves and the have-nots. So what do they do now? What would Johnson, if Johnson wants his legacy to be levelling up, where does he need to be targeting? What policy, has he not given any yet, do you think he needs to be outlining?
Well, I think he needs to be braver. I mean, this is, after all, a majority Conservative government that doesn't face an election for several years. The economy has performed better than expected this year. I know that there are some problems at the moment, but hopefully they're only temporary. I think the public finances will improve more quickly than most people, including the Treasury, are currently anticipating. So he has an opportunity to be brave and to be bold. I think it is discouraging that the planning reforms, for example, seem to be put on the back burner because of the political problems that you're suggesting. But ultimately, the solution to the housing crisis is to build more homes, and if that means loosening the planning regulations, then so be it. I think similarly on taxation, it's important to recognise that the government needs to go for growth, and anything that adds to the risk of a cost of living crisis over the next few months and years, including the prospect of higher taxes, I think needs to be avoided. So a relentless focus on growth, deregulation, on allowing markets to work properly, I think that's what it needs to do. But politically, that's very difficult. I recognise there's enormous pressure on politicians to be seen to be doing something, to be making nice announcements, 500 million here, 500 million there for pet projects. But this is an opportunity, I think, for the government to be bold, and it does need to take it.
But the things you've just listed there, the government seems to be doing exactly the opposite. Instead of reducing taxation, they're adding a bigger tax burden to absolutely everybody, including, 16-year-olds working in the checkout of their local supermarket, by putting up national insurance. In terms of the families who have struggled the most during this pandemic, he's slashing that boost to universal credit. He might have been able to get away with saying that other issues, such as the petrol crisis and gas hikes, are, not me, Gov, these are external forces. But it's been continuous neglect of things like a sensible, joined-together, cohesive energy strategy that sees us in this mess. And now, of course, we've got the end of furlough. And while we've got a huge amount of vacancies, it's really not that easy to move people who need jobs into jobs, is it? So surely they're going backwards and we could be facing a winter of discontent.
Well, I think that's right. In lots of areas, they are going backwards. So one of the legacies of the pandemic is, of course, the huge increase in government spending and debt. Now, as it happens, I think that was the right thing to do when large parts of the economy were shut down by the pandemic, and people had to be paid to stay at home rather than work because we wanted to save the lives of others. But that has sort of created a mentality that the solution to any problem is more government spending, more intervention, more red tape, more regulation. Now, that's something traditionally we associate with Labour, but arguably the Tories are lurching in that direction as well. I think that might create some sort of short-term positive political headlines and some nice sound bites, but ultimately I think that will start to undermine the economic recovery, when what the government really needs to do is to step aside in loads of areas, like the labour market, like the setting of energy prices, and basically let the economy work again as it should do.
But I mean, we are in a situation where we're still waiting on those top lines of policy from the government. Do you think Boris is going to dig deep and impress people when he does his keynote speech tomorrow? Do you think there's going to be something brand new, bold and exciting? And maybe that's the reason we haven't heard of any sort of meat on the bones yet.
But I haven't got high hopes for Boris Johnson's speech, but to be fair, I didn't have high hopes for Keir Starmer's speech either. It's not normally the political leaders that announce the specifics of policy. I think we need to look ahead to specific announcements from key ministers. So the budget from the Chancellor Rishi Sunak later this month, I think, will be extremely important, and I'll be watching that nervously. Now, what I'm hoping is that better economic forecasts and better numbers for the public finances will allow him to signal that he will indeed be able to cap taxes over the next few years, and at the very least not add to the burden that in the ways that he's already done. So those are the specifics I'll be looking for, but I wouldn't hold my breath for anything substantial from the Prime Minister this week.
Julian, thank you very much for your candour. My next guest who joins me is Jonathan Gullis, Conservative MP for Stoke-on-Trent North. Now, Jonathan, you come from a constituency which could potentially do with a little bit of levelling up. Do you think that your government is up to the task? Because so far they seem to be lowering universal credit, putting up the cost of national insurance, and their brilliant housing strategy during the pandemic just helped wealthy people buy bigger houses.
Well, it's good to speak to you, Ducky. First of all, I'm obviously delighted to be on GB News. And let's talk about what's happening with this government. We've got a government that's invested £17.6 million in the town of Kidsgrove. When Labour run Newcastle Borough Council, they invested no more than £15,000 over 6 years. Because of that £17.6 million, the sports centre, which Labour let close for a single pound, is now going to be reopened and refurbished under a Conservative-run council and a Conservative government. So that shows you what levelling up is doing to our local community. In Stoke-on-Trent, we were the first for job growth in 2020. We were the eighth quickest growing economy in England as well. So this idea that levelling up isn't happening is simply for the birds. And when Captain Hindsight, Mr. Forensic, is busy saying there's no plan for Stoke, perhaps he should actually read the Stoke prospectus, which is about powering up Stoke-on-Trent, which was endorsed by Stoke-on-Trent City Council, has the backing of all 3 Stoke-on-Trent MPs, and ultimately has had not a single Labour councillor in my local area say a damn thing. So ultimately I won't be taking lectures from any Labour Party about levelling up when they allowed 70 years of rot to happen because they thought Stoke was just voting fodder for them.
Well, I think we can all agree that there's been a lot of rot that's set in this country, but it has been a Conservative government for the past 15 years. And when you say that levelling up is happening, it might not feel that way to a family who has seen their national insurance hiked, especially someone, say, who's from a young working class background, who can't get on the housing ladder, who's now going to be paying more in tax to help pensioners in £1 million properties. So where is this levelling up other than an odd, leisure centre here and there? And I'm sure that there have been great work done in local constituencies, but it seems to me that the squeezed middle are going to be very squeezed this winter, what with gas prices soaring, with the petrol shortages and prices at the pump going up.
Well, let's remember, first of all, the levelling up. Michael Gove made it very clear that it's not just the levelling up department. This is a cross-government thing. You don't turn around decades of neglect in these areas overnight. This is not just a 5-year project. But levelling up is more than, like you say, a leisure centre. It's about the 550 jobs that the Home Office is coming to Stoke-on-Trent. It's about the £3 million it's going to create up to 2,000 jobs at the Chaffley Valley site. It's about in Kidsgrove and Tork. It's got so much more at the end of the day. It's about creating a jobs, wealth and creation opportunity that I'm really, really excited about. And ultimately, it's something that we're going to work really hard to achieve. And we are seeing already, as I say, in the city of Stoke, where we are the first for jobs growth in England at this moment in time. But let's not forget, as I say, you don't turn around this ship overnight. And when you talk about national insurance, when you go door knocking in Stoke-on-Trent, people are fully aware that we borrowed over £400 billion in order to spend and save and protect as many jobs as we possibly could. And everyone in Stoke-on-Trent, working class, understands understands that you need to count your pennies, and that means when the government needs to bring more into the Treasury in order to keep the finances strong, they take that seriously, and that's what you're seeing under this government. Serious action with a serious plan, taking the tough decisions, not a nearly £200 billion worth of spending commitments without any idea where it's coming from. Again, Captain Hindsight, we're still waiting for the detail.
I mean, good old Captain Hindsight. You just said you can't turn this ship around overnight, but the Conservatives have been in power for 15 years. It's been a long time since we had a Labour government. At what point are we going to stop blaming the Labour Party for this huge gap between the haves and the have-nots and start looking a bit more inwardly about successive Conservative governments?
Well, I'm really glad, again, Alex, giving me the opportunity, because Stoke-on-Trent was only taken over at the City Council level in May 2019 by the Conservatives and Councillor Abby Brown, a fantastic leader, young female dynamic leader of our City Council. We obviously only just got 3 MPs. What happened is we had 2 Labour MPs in 2019 who had such a poverty of aspiration for our city. They had no plan. They didn't talk about Stoke. You were lucky if you saw them in the chamber. I've mentioned Stoke-on-Trent probably 5 times more than my predecessor. I've spoken in the House the same amount of times in 18 months that she did in 4.5 years. So if you want to understand why Stoke-on-Trent was forgotten, it's because no one was talking about it. But now you've got Jack Brereton, Joe Gideon and myself in Stoke-on-Trent working as a team, and we are delivering for the people of Stoke-on-Trent, North, Kidsgrove and Tork.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.